Namaste and greetings. I, Mahima Kapoor, researcher and assistant editor at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, welcome you all to the IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a distinguished lecture on different views among the great powers about international order under the series, The State of International Affairs, #Diplomacy Dialogue. This talk is being organized by the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies and delivered by Professor Michael B. Yahuda. I'm honored to introduce the speaker for the session, Professor Michael B. Yahuda. Sir is a Professor Emeritus of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, University of London, where he served from 1973 to 2003. Since then, he has been a visiting scholar at the Sigur Center for Asian Studies, the Elliott School, and the George Washington University. He has been a visiting research fellow at the Australian National University and a visiting professor at the University of Adelaide and the University of Michigan. He has also been a guest scholar and fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Washington, D.C., and the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Studies, Harvard. He was a visiting senior fellow at the Singaporean Institute for Southeast Asian Studies and at the Chinese Foreign Affairs University, Beijing. Sir has acted as an advisor to the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office and as a consultant to organizations in London and Singapore. His main fields of interest are China's politics, foreign policy, and the international relations of the Asia-Pacific. He enjoys an international reputation as a specialist on the politics of East Asia. He has published 10 books and more than 200 articles and chapters in books. His latest book include The International Politics of the Asia-Pacific. He is awaiting the publication of a kind of autobiography called My Life as a Cosmopolitan. He is currently working on a book on the resurgence of Asia, an account of the last 5,000 years. It outlines achievements in Asia until the advent of the West and the rise and the relative decline of the West and the new re-emergence of Asia. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you very much. Very kind.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. We are fortunate to have Professor Siddharth Mallavarapu and Dr. Satoru Nagao as the discussants for the session. Professor Siddharth is a professor in the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Satoru is a fellow at Hudson Institute and senior research fellow at Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, Tokyo, Japan. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. The deliberation is being moderated by Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and editorial director at IMPRI. I invite Dr. Mehta to take the proceedings further, and we look forward to learning from our esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahima, and good evening to everyone from India, and good morning to friends in the United States. So great powers have always been very prominent in international relations. Their rise and fall have often led to structural transformations of international relations. What is international order? It broadly refers to the international economic institutions, bilateral and regional security organizations, and political norms, and also their ordering mechanisms. This has become very articulate since the end of the Second World War and the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers. The questions that arises is that whether these two countries and other two major powers that emerged after the end of the Cold War agree, reaffirm, and converge on the concept of international order. What does it take to build an inclusive and sustainable international order that would understand the existing international order assess the current challenges to that order, and recommend the ways forward with respect to that order. So to discuss these questions and beyond, we are honored to be hosting this distinguished lecture by Professor Michael Yahuda, joining us from United States, along with an eminent panel of discussants, Professor Siddharth Mallavarapu, my teacher, and Dr. Satoru Nagao, joining us from Tokyo, Japan. I extend my warm welcome to you all and to all the participants here on Zoom and on Facebook Live. I yield the floor to Professor Yahuda. Professor Yahuda, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Normally, when people speak of great powers, they look at it from a fair distance, in the sense that they regard the great powers as those that can shape the character of international relations at any given point. But what I want to do now is to really look at it from the other angle. That is to say, not looking above at how the great powers operate, but really looking from the perspective of the great powers themselves. What is it that they think is the order that would favor them, and carry on from there? Now, the traditional view of international order is that there are rules, international institutions, there's international law, and norm-producing patterns of relating to each other and action. But if we turn it around a little bit and try and look at it from the perspective of the different great powers, we get a rather different picture. First of all, I should note that it's only the great powers that have views that are significant for international order as a whole, not just for their narrow interests. And for our purposes, only India, China, Russia, and the United States qualify as great powers who think about global development and act upon it. And then in the second tier, there's Japan and perhaps the European Union. So I'll start with the current Chinese, or rather the Communist Party of China's view of international order. At present, it is a two-pronged reaction to the current order. The current order is seen in Beijing as favoring the United States. Consequently, the Chinese would prefer an order based on multilateralism as the first step. They regard the present one as largely created by the United States, that is now under challenge. The Chinese would prefer, at least to start with, an order that is based on multilateralism as a first step. That would increase the space for eventually an international order that would lead to China's centrality. Relations would develop as partnerships, more generally granting a larger role for less developed countries until a rejuvenated China could take the lead, as suggested by its traditional view of itself as having received the mandate of heaven to rule all that is below heaven, at least as adjusted to suit modern conditions. The US would like to recast the post-World War II settlement in which all countries would follow an international order with the US as the leader. Much stress would be put on international law and international norms, which would invalidate many of China's maritime claims. So in that sense, there is a mixture of ideological and realistic policies that divide China and the United States. Russia would like to see its role enhanced as when it was the Soviet Union. That would not necessarily require the restoration of the old borders, but it would require deference to Russian leadership by the former members of the Soviet Union. In other words, there would be a kind of duopoly with the United States, but one that is joined by China and India. India still stands for the principles of non-alignment. It would prefer, in my view, partnerships rather than treaty-bound alliances. India would then become a permanent member of the UN Security Council, perhaps together with Japan. The two would then replace Britain and France as former colonial powers in the United Nations Security Council, which reflected the international conditions of the late 1940s. Finally, India would like a peaceable relationship with China. Then we could say that Japan could be included as a great power for the purposes of this argument about great powers. It is no longer bound by its previous position as embracing pacifism. Its economy is still sufficiently large to shape the regional and perhaps the global economies. Now that it is rebuilding the military forces, Japan is rapidly building its armed forces not only for its own defense, but also for Taiwan and more broadly for its region. The EU is divided. It's lacking in the capacity to defend itself without calling on the United States. But in certain respects, it's a major economic power that seeks to promote international law and a degree of security in the Asia-Pacific. Now, let me continue with a few more observations. We live at a time of transition. And it's a transition that affects the domestic politics as well as the international politics of each of the countries I mentioned. The United States, as much as it may proclaim its adherence to democracy, its own democracy is in great difficulties. There is a putative, I was going to say charismatic, perhaps that's the wrong word, but it's got a populist leader only that has taken over one of the major American parties, namely the Republicans. And clearly he seeks to stand for president at the next presidential elections. And what he will offer is major changes to the structure of American politics, and it would be a challenge to the existing domestic American political system. And in that sense, America is rather unstable. That those who are seeking to hold power have very different views as to how to exercise American power. I might add that despite all the talk of China's rise, America is still by far the most powerful country in the world. It stands atop the power system of the different countries. And it is the major economy in the world. And it certainly seeks to change the norms and behaviors of the international system. It proclaims adherence to international law and democracy, even though if you were to examine both, you would find American leadership rather questionable. As far as China is concerned, at the moment, it's also in a period of transition. Superficially, it seems that the Communist Party runs everything, and it follows Trotsky's old claim that having a Communist Party system means not only having a Communist Central Committee, and from that a political bureau, and from that a standing committee of the political bureau, but in fact a one-man leadership. And like all one-man leaderships, this one seems on the surface very stable, but in fact it is not. China is not yet equivalent to the United States, and in my view, probably never will be. It's got this demographic challenge in which the proportion of the population who may be regarded as the working sector of the economy has been diminishing continuously over these last 4 years, and all the signs indicate that the population as a whole is diminishing. In fact, for the last 4 years, the number of deaths is now increasing beyond the number of births. And given the fact that China has really been able to grow by having lots of new people joining the workforce, they're going to find that that is a fundamental structural change. And the signs so far are that the Chinese government is struggling to adapt to that. I'm sure that you all are aware that its major property company is on the verge of collapse, and it depends very much as to how much the central government is prepared to finance the problem of this major property company, Evergrande. In addition to which, most of China's major companies, which are state-owned, are heavily in debt. And so there's a financial overlay that again becomes part of the structural problems of China. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that China would be able to struggle along despite these structural problems. But clearly, if the World Bank anticipates that China's growth is going to be around 3% a year, that is hardly sufficient growth to enable it to overcome American leadership of the economy, let alone the politics of the world as it exists. So China is faced with many problems that only China can address. The outside world may try to influence China, but it has no power over China. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, China has withdrawn more into itself and is seeking once again to be kind of self-reliant. At the same time, China enjoys its position as the leading country in international trade, despite its economic problems. India also has very big domestic problems. Its current leader, Prime Minister Modi, is really engaged in what some people call the Hinduization of the country. That is, putting all the stress on Hindus, although you might argue that Hinduism is a religion, it's more than that. It's also a social system. It has its own philosophical roots, and as well as religious ones. And as far as Modi is concerned, the others have to adopt a more subordinate position. Now, how far the Modi approach is sustainable is still doubtful. So Japan has just had a change of leadership, and with each leader you find a different emphasis on how to administer this vast country with its many differences, with its many ethnic diversity, different religions, and so on. And I don't think seeking to impose one of the ethnic religious groupings as the only one of significance is not likely to last. India is too big and too complex a country to have one system imposed upon it. And so from that perspective, all the great powers have very deep problems within them, and that necessarily shapes their view of the world. America, by tradition, has sought to, first of all, view itself and want others to view it as this kind of beacon on the hill, the kind of country that most other peoples seek to replicate. At least that's the American view. And hence, for them, apart from the power concerns, there's also a strong ideological aspect to it. It's, in fact, the current President Biden seeks to engage the relationship with the Soviet Union almost on an ideological basis. He wants to encourage what he calls democracy throughout the world, but clearly America in itself is no longer the symbol of democracy in the world. It has to overcome the crisis looming, centering on Donald Trump. And as long as that is there in the system, there is a sense of instability about the United States itself. Russia, again, has instability within it. Its economy, in some ways, is a kind of third world economy in which it is based very much on the export of raw materials, particularly gas and oil. True, it does have still an industrial base, and its military in particular deals with advanced technology. But as a country as a whole, one wouldn't say it's in a healthy condition. And again, it has a one-man leader, and one-man leaders may look very stable, but in principle, unless there's a clear view of what the succession might be, it's prone to be regarded as inherently unstable. Now, India too has got a big transition to take place. Nobody knows what the succession will be when Modi is no longer the leader. I might say that the Indian domestic political scene, in which I don't claim expertise, is nevertheless one of great diversity. The different states, although may be equal in law, they are not equal in terms of the weight that they have within India as a whole. For example, there's the continual trouble with Kashmir, which goes to the heart of Indian identity, which also involves a deep-rooted difference with Pakistan. India at the moment has different currents that it can follow. The kind of Hinduization, perhaps, I don't think is sustainable. When you think that that India has perhaps more, I don't know the figures offhand, but has certainly more Muslims than Pakistan, and more Muslims perhaps than the Middle East. So, of course, India is not allowed to be a member of the Islamic grouping of countries, yet, and also India on the whole does not seek to play a role in relations between Islamic countries, but it wants its voice to be heard. Which country have I not dealt with? Well, the EU, of course, is deeply divided amongst itself, even as it seeks to set the norms for the world as a whole by emphasizing the values that emerged at the end of the Second World War. But it also wants to stress on the less developing countries. And in that sense, it's a kind of competition with China as to who should be regarded as the leader in quotation marks, that is to say, the most prominent advocate of what used to be called third world or less developed interests. So I think I've exceeded by a few minutes my allotted time, and I apologize for that.
No, certainly not, sir. Thank you so much. You have touched upon so many important points and the countries. So that really deems explanation. So thank you so much. I would invite Professor Siddharth Mallavarapu to share his remarks. And also you could touch upon the sections which maybe on India, especially which Professor Yahuda has spoken, and respond to those as well.
Yeah, thank you. At the outset, my gratitude to the hosts, IMPRI, for having invited me on this occasion. I must begin with a small disclaimer. I've not had the luxury of reading this paper, but my remarks are largely derived from what I've heard just now from Professor Yahuda's talk. I must compliment Professor Yahuda at the outset for an informed and thoughtful survey of the divergences in the manner in which order is currently conceived by the major powers of the day. I think there are challenges which seem to, in a sense, face different countries in the manner in which they respond to the world at large, both in the present, but also going ahead. I think quite clearly It'll depend very much on how they respond to the specific challenges which Professor Yahuda just outlined with regard to each of these countries. I mean, to begin with, in terms of nomenclature, I've never been very comfortable with the term great powers. My preference is maybe for the term major powers, but I understand that in definitional terms, I think great powers are understood as having fairly fundamental capabilities in terms of system shaping. And to that end, I think while we think about the notion of material influence, while we think of the notion of influence in terms of ideas, influence in terms of shaping existing political, social, and economic arrangements, not just in one specific country, but more broadly, I think they certainly have an important role. And I think what was interesting about Professor Yahuda's perspective here was that he was trying to reside within these countries and try to think about, how does the world look like from the perspective of these independent major powers? How do they view the world? What are they seeing? What are the challenges they're likely to face? And how are they likely to respond to this in the years to come? I think I would sort of broadly, in a sense, concur with many of the points which Professor Yahuda just laid out. But I had specific questions for each of these countries, which I hope at some point, could be addressed in the remarks maybe Professor Yahuda makes later. I think to begin with, of course, I think China is interesting. Nobody's going to miss the elephant in the room. It's a major power. Some would argue it's a revisionist power. Its intent on, certainly changing the status quo. Its preference for a multilateral order is something I think Professor Yahuda spelled out, and it envisages, or it looks at the present order as one which is really a residue of what the United States has created, and therefore at some stage, if there is an opportunity, it would like to, of course, construct an order in which it's a central author in more ways than one. The question I had with regard to even multilateralism vis-a-vis China is whether at some point, if China acquires a certain quantum of further economic strength and perhaps even military strength, is it likely to change its perspective on multilateralism? Will it at some point be intent on more fundamental changes in the order, or is it likely to be really tinkering, as it seems to do at this stage, largely with existing multilateral arrangements? After all, if we do agree that the Bretton Woods institutions, for instance, are really a legacy of an earlier period in which post-Second World War, with the US and the ascendant, these institutions came into existence. Will these institutions still be the fundamental site in which multilateral politics is played out, or will there be a desire perhaps to create a fresh set of institutions with a far more central role for China in determining not just the questions about composition and decision making, but more fundamentally to alter the texture of how we transact business internationally? That's just a thought I wanted to sort of forefront initially when it came to China. I do agree with the point of view that today it is wrong to ascribe any degree of equivalence today when it comes to China and the United States. I think the challenges which were mentioned, two in specific with regard to China, in terms of the continuing leadership, as well as the challenge of changing demographics, demographics which does not necessarily advantage China, but in some senses disadvantages it, is something which not many would disagree with. I think with regard to the United States, it's interesting to again think about this whole idea about to what extent is a rule-based international order, and to what extent do liberal values still hold sway in terms of how we can think about the US structuring of the world system. Quite clearly, I think in the Trump administration, there was clearly a retreat from some forms of multilateralism. It became far more inward looking. And I think Professor Yahuda's point about the fact that Trump or Trump's politics at some plane is still around in some form or the other. It's not something which is entirely disappeared from the scene. And as long as it is there, it still poses a challenge when it comes to American multilateralism or attempts at shaping elements when it comes to thinking about how we do business internationally with regard to a whole range of questions which concern all these countries. I think the issue about the former Soviet Union, again, I think many have recognized that there is an element where there is a tendency for the economy to be skewed largely in terms of the two resources. I think Professor Yahuda mentioned gas and oil. And there is a certain nostalgia about former influence the Soviet Union perhaps at one point exercised over large swaths in the world. But I think quite clearly Russia, nobody would disagree, is faced with its own challenges of internal authoritarianism. And there is, of course, the question of what it requires then to also fare much better in economic terms to avoid the distortions of really depending only on these two resources, gas and oil. I think coming to India, India has its own share of ideological challenges. I think in terms of a broad stroke, Professor Yahuda suggested that non-alignment is still the fundamental fulcrum, which in a sense determines the manner in which India likes to respond to the world. I do think that we are now, there is clearly an effort to constantly emphasize that we should not be overly ideologically driven in some respects when we in a sense play a certain role within the international system, but more fundamentally think about it in terms of pragmatic partnerships. There has traditionally been an aversion to alliances. This is an aversion to alliances which goes back to the early years as well, where we've always felt that alliances too tightly reduce the room for maneuver and too tightly structure the possibilities which might otherwise have been open. And therefore, that aversion to alliances appears to continue even today, although we're very open in some respects to strategic partnerships. Quite clearly, I think India is acutely conscious of the fact that there are deep democratic deficits when it comes to international organizations. I think the permanent membership of the UN Security Council is something which has constantly been a fairly important consideration for a country like India. And I imagine, as Professor Yahuda pointed, for countries like Japan, which also in a sense, need to be more fairly represented in bodies like this. One could think about, when we're thinking about domestic politics and foreign policy, the question I had is, can we make a distinction here between domestic politics and the ideological shaping of domestic politics and its actual influence when it comes to foreign policy? Some would argue that India is less didactic and more pragmatic in some sense, and that I do concur with the broad point Professor Yahuda spelled out a little while earlier, which is to say that for a country as complex and diverse as India, there is really no choice. We're likely to veer around to the middle way. And I think that's something which has been borne out more generally. If you look at the long trends in politics, there is a preference for the middle path. There is a tendency for politics eventually to coalesce around a certain middle path understanding of how we can stand in relation to specific issues. And that's perhaps something which is likely to be the case over time. But one will have to watch this carefully to see how that shapes up. With Japan, I think clearly there are changes underway as well. I think the point about retreat from some earlier traditions of pacifism, reconsidering the military forces and strengthening of the military forces, the role of the economy with potentially, which still continues to have an impact, which is not restricted only to Japan. I think these are elements which quite clearly are present. The diversity question, I think, has been posed both in the context of Japan and India, and I do think that eventually we have to find ways in which we are able to celebrate elements of that diversity and provide for a politics which really celebrates that diversity in order to focus on the things which really matter in foreign policy. With regard to the European Union, I think mention was made about the fact that the European Union also is committed to a rules-based international order. Some would argue that the European Union, in some respects, is really a site for dense legal institutionalism, somewhat unprecedented in some respects. So it's interesting to think about this question when we're thinking about the question of order and conceptualizing order. To what extent do we, in a sense, bring forth arguments which place a certain premium on norms, on international law, on the idea of international society, which Hedley Bull once referred to in his famous book, The Anarchical Society. To what extent can we think about these elements coexisting with all the other elements we've just heard a little while ago, which Professor Yahuda mentioned at some length. I have two questions, broad questions relating to transitions and ideology. One, of course, if we go by power transition theory, at least one strand of power transition theory would argue that there is inevitably likely to be a tension between status quoists and revisionist powers. So this is a question which has often interested international relations scholars. If we think of the United States in this case as in this instance as a status quoist power and China as a revisionist power, is it likely that at some stage this might take the form of conflict, of real conflict? Of course, you could have what Yun Fung Kong once called in his book, Knowledge's War, where he looked at the idea of a classic overtake, where I think the United States overtook the United Kingdom post-Second World War. And there was a power transition which took place, which did not necessarily ensue in the form of conflict one normally envisages with regard to the tension between status quoists and revisionist powers. But that's not the norm necessarily. So we don't really know whether this conflict is going to be sublimated through institutions, through norms, through legal procedures, through a rule-based multilateral order, or at some point is it going to spill over into forms of conflict which we do not really think are desirable. And the final point also about ideology. I think there are two dimensions here while looking at these countries and their perspective on order. So to what extent do beliefs about oneself matter within the international system? To what extent are perceptions also linked to how others view us from the outside? And is there a meeting point between these two pictures? Do they, in all these instances we've talked about, the United States, China, Russia, India, the EU, perhaps Japan, in all these instances, it'd be interesting to think about to what extent is there a neat mapping of self-belief versus, say, an image from the outside, how others view you. And in some cases, they may be congruence, in some cases, they may not be congruence to the extent one would perhaps like to see internally from within these countries. So it'd be interesting to see if Professor Yahuda has some thoughts on this particular question. I'd like to hear more about it. And finally, I think when we come to thinking about order, in international relations thinking quite clearly, at least you can have 3 or 4 very distinct pictures of viewing order. One, of course, is the standard realist lens, which places a far greater emphasis on material power and standing as really the determinants of order. And that's where the influence of these major powers is critical. Liberal institutionalists, of course, are likely to argue that there's certain autonomy institutions still enjoy in the international system, notwithstanding the role of the major powers to influence the manner in which international politics plays out. And I think constructivists in the English school, theorists would argue that norms matter, culture matters. You can think about some notion of international society even today, notwithstanding the various pulls and pressures. And it might be interesting to see if this still holds sway in the world we live in. I'll stop with that. Thank you. I thought it was a very rich and enjoyable presentation of ideas relating to conceptions of order from the perspective of all these countries.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. And you have really enriched it further. Thank you so much. So I would invite Dr. Satoru Nagao to share his remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot from Professor Yahuda. It is an honor for me to ask the questions and comment from now. Instead of the little long explanation, I want to ask Professor 8 questions. A little bit much, 8 questions. First one is if China will not catch up the United States, which country is the real most serious competitor for the United States? This is a question because President Biden said China is the most serious competitor. But in your calculations, China will not catch up the United States. So, but last 246 years, the U.S. history, United States is competing with other great powers, and finally they reach the only one superpower in the world. So in the US society itself, competition is a very vital part, I think. So indeed, last 246 years is US history. US spent only the 169 years to change just a colony of the British Empire to the only one superpower in the world. And the last 76 years, US has kept their status. So view from this situation, the rival or competitor is very important part of the US policy, I think. And indeed, I'm Japanese. That is the reason I feel this is very important, because last 246 years, all of the rivals has disappeared, including Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union, indeed. So that's why to set up the goal of the foreign policy, to set up the goal of the nation, indeed, the most serious competitor is very important part, I believe. So in this case, if China is not the most serious competitor, which country? It's a very important part to understand the US foreign policy, I believe. That is, I asked this question. Thank you very much. And I should not speak too long. Of course, I like the United States, but at the same time, I want to analyze the US foreign policy from this. Second question is related with the first question. If China ally with Russia, will it be the serious threat for the United States? That is second question. So China is not a serious competitor, but if China-Russia combination, situation is changed, I think. So in this case, what do you think, sir? That is my question. Third question. If the United States is not the symbol of the democracy, which country will lead the democratic countries is another question. This is a question related to the number 1, number 2, but at the same time, a little different aspect. Because Freedom House in the United States pointed out, the free countries are reducing. In 2005, 89 countries are free countries, but 2020 number has declined to 82. So in the non-free countries, in the count, in 2005, the number of the non-free country is 45, but 2020, this is 54, increased. So in their view, democracy is under threat. So in this case, I think someone need to lead this one. In the most case, remember, US leading role in the democratic world. And now question 4 is related with question 3, indeed. If the US need to recover their leading role, what should the US do? This is a little policy related, policy recommendation I want to hear. And so number 5, question 5, about the rule-based order. Rule-based order is a very important word, especially when we talk about the security in the Indo-Pacific. So, but rule-based order, in the rule-based order, who will decide the rule is very important. So in the future, who will decide the rules? Especially in the Indo-Pacific. That is my question. Will US will lead the Indo-Pacific, or more different system will decide the rule? Maybe something like that. From question number 6 to 8 is connected because more specific questions. If China invade Taiwan, will the US intervene? Is question 6. And why the 7 and 8 is connected with question 6? Because the different place. If China occupied all of the South China Sea, will the US intervene? Is another question. So not Taiwan. Question 6 is Taiwan. Question 7 is South China Sea. And question 8 is Indo-China borders. If China invade India, in the Indo-China border, will the US intervene? It's 8 questions. So this is all of the 8 questions. Of course, you can choose the best question and answer it, but it is honor for me to ask this question. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Satoru. You have raised very, very important questions indeed. So it needs to be really thought about. Thank you so much. So I would ask Professor Yahuda to respond to the remarks and the questions that have been raised by Siddharth sir and Dr. Satoru.
Well, in the time available, I will not be able to discuss all the issues that have been raised. There's the question of China as the elephant in the room, and indeed it is. I mean, it's one of the things that China and India have in common is that in the present world, neither can be invaded and occupied. So that creates a problem of a balance between the two. And I think one of the big questions that does need to be addressed is what kind of relationship can India envisage in a pragmatic way with China. Obviously, there are sources of conflict, but there are also sources of commonality. So I think that's one of the big unanswered questions that we face. I see China as instead of having a projection in which it just gets more and more successful, I think China is facing a problem of enormous proportions in regard to its own domestic issues, and it has to address those as well as foreign affairs. Now, some people say that foreign affairs is used to focus its nationalistic people on the unity of China. Now, that may be possible, but I think there are various difficulties along the way for that. Then both questioners have touched on demographics, and clearly demographic change is not at the moment in favor of China. The Western world is also facing that issue, but the Western world is better equipped to deal with decline of population numbers than perhaps a less developed country, certainly a huge country such as China. India faces a demographic problem, but in a different way, in the sense that its population is not declining, it's continuing to rise. And as a primarily a poor country, India requires very much assistance from the outside world. And in some ways, that assistance is there. Japan is one of the major contributors to investment in India. But the transition was never easy. There was a question of the idea of how countries believe in their identities and act upon it, and the extent to which others really see it that way and see it in the context of order. Now, we live very much in a world that is moved by nationalism, and nationalism raises the issue of self-belief in a rather different way. In the sense it's not necessarily one that is based on agreement between different interests and different outlooks. Nationalism seeks to override all of those, and that in itself opens the door to other issues. We saw how Europe, in a not so distant past, tore itself apart on questions of nationalism. That's unlikely. And there's one issue we haven't really talked about, and that is the nuclear one. To what extent are those possessing nuclear power also constrained by not being able to use it? And that also includes North Korea. And it's one thing to be able to threaten and to shout into a microphone, but it's another to risk using nuclear weapons, because any country that the North could attack is one that could respond even more strongly. So, but nevertheless, the nuclear cloud has not disappeared. Now, to refer to some of the 8 questions that were raised, well, China is already trying to change the international institutions and the norms of international society, to use that old term from the so-called English school. But if the UN is taken over in some ways by China, by Chinese concerns, then the issues that the UN addresses will still be there. And if the UN can't handle them in a way that the UN was stymied for a long time because of the Cold War between Russia and the United States, that is still possible involving the United States and China. How far does that change the world? Well, it creates a new irritant, but whether it really changes the world, the issue will be, for example, how to bridge the gap between the less developed and the developed countries, which is supposedly a core issue for China. Well, I'm not sure that China has really addressed that question properly. What China has addressed are Chinese interests that maybe are packaged in different ways in different contexts. But as far as the future for China, as seen by Xi Jinping and his supporters, is that China will end up as the bearer of the mandate of heaven in the current era. But I don't think that that is likely, because China is so self-centered that it has offended not only its neighbors, but most of the countries in the world that are not dependent on China in one form or another. So in that sense, China can be a disruptor, but whether it can provide construction, I doubt very much. So China can influence the rules, but it cannot decide them. As I try to argue, all the countries in a way have got used to depending on the United States, but it is the United States now that is in deep trouble between the Trumpists and the democratic elements that still remain there and the law. So it's finding a deficit of trust, I think is the term, that is used by, indeed, many of the countries that actually do depend for their survival on the United States. So I'm not sure that we really have an order at the moment. We have elements of order in the sense that it seems very unlikely that nuclear weapons can be used, but nevertheless, we can't rule it out. A crisis could escalate and move beyond the control of a so-called rational decision maker. So we can't rule out nuclear weapons. We can't really agree that there are rules that concern the production, let alone the deployment of nuclear weapons. So although people don't talk about that very much, I think it's still an overriding issue. Do the Israelis have nuclear weapons? Well, most people seem to think that they do, but they are not included in the normal discussions between nuclear powers. And there are signs that others in the Middle East feel that they must have nuclear capacities too. So these are all questions that go back to an earlier period regarding the proliferation, but nevertheless, it hasn't gone away. Now, the question was raised about one's own sense of identity or self-belief and how that affects external relations and ultimately also views of international order by others, and where does this sense of identity fit into that? Well, one could argue that there is an element of conflict in the international society, and I use the word advisedly because that presumes that a society involves more than just relationships of power, but involves agreements about diplomacy and various other forms of resolving conflicts. So there are some practical questions about China allied with Russia and where the United States will be. Well, neither China nor Russia look upon each other as real allies. They look at each other as partners. After all, one of the major sources of arms for India and others is Russia. And so here is India notionally in conflict with China, and there is Russia arming its adversary. Now that doesn't suggest to me the way allies behave. And then, does it really matter how we count up the number of democracies and number of non-democracies? I know there are many people who like to think in terms of numbers, but how many of these 40 so-called democracies are really democracies? Who knows? And do the non-democracies have some kind of elements of democracy within them, or aspirations to democracy within them? Who knows? Now, the basic question, I suppose, is who decides the rules of this international order, if there is one? I would suggest at present, no one decides the rules. I know there is the residue of the rules as existed a few decades ago. In fact, one could argue that one of the distinctions of the Cold War is that both protagonists operated within a number of informal rules. But today, that is not the case. China is seeking to change international institutions in its favor. I'm not sure America has yet fully addressed this, but it is an issue in which the Chinese are certainly saying that they're not following rules because the Americans have imposed them and they serve American interests. And that in effect, they keep us down. So I'm not sure we have real rules. We have some elements of rules in the sense of, there's the Universal Union of Postal Services. There's rules about flying passenger and cargo aeroplanes. There are rules about how ships are dealt with in foreign ports, and all sorts of things. But these are really facilitators of economic exchanges. But in terms of power, I think we are really in this question of transition that Professor Siddharth mentioned. I don't think it's necessarily involves the kind of conflict that the great Athenian historian suggested. He suggested that the origins of the wars in Greece was because Athens could not accept the growth of Sparta, and therefore war was inevitable. But I don't think that applies. These are two heavily nuclear armed, or three heavily nuclear armed countries. How can they go to war? They can have skirmishes. They can have even battles. They can have proxy wars. But how can these two really go to war? Or these three really go to war? I don't see it. But I'll stop there.
Right. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for responding to those questions so patiently and definitely adding to the discourses. So thank you so much. So going ahead, we have some time left for questions from the audience, and I would like to give Professor Yahuda some rest and ask Professor Siddharth one question from Dr. Bamdev Sigdal. He asks, it's his comment, and if you could respond to that. I think aid diplomacy has failed, and thus emerging countries like India should come up with more investment and trade activities so as to enhance cooperation with with countries of South Asia as well as other developing countries instead of joining in groupings. So would you like to take this question? This is a question from Dr. Sigdal from Nepal.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sigdal, for that question. I've also briefly responded in the chat box already, but just to reiterate the point, I think there is a classic assumption that if you increase economic interdependence between countries, that it might actually diminish conflict. And that's the hope very often, especially when it comes to recourse to trade and the desire to sort of recognize that it creates dependencies also among people, and the scope, therefore, there's a sense of mutual interest, which sometimes might actually act as a positive goad to avoid or diminish the possibility of conflict. Of course, I think while thinking about groupings, I think clearly India has been quite wary of alliances because they tend to be rather formal. They tend to, in a sense, as India sees it, limit choices rather than enhance choices. And therefore, I think there is a temptation sometimes to take recourse to partnerships, strategic partnerships as well, but not necessarily alliances in the classic sense of alliances. And I think that's likely to continue. I don't see that changing immediately at all in terms of how India then goes on to do that. But I think there is, of course, possibility for, I think, far greater work, even in terms of the attractiveness of as an investment destination, for instance, the economic attractiveness elements to be built within the country as well. I think there is talk of bureaucratic reforms very often in order to enable greater investments even within the country, and to use some of that economic growth eventually to also enter into new trade alliances and trade relationships or economic partnerships with other countries. I think that hopefully should flow from the fact that there is a fair amount of domestic strength felt to be able to do that. And I think this will depend ultimately on how all of this plays out. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor, I would just like to ask a follow-up question to that. You taught us about great power rivalry as a major theme or a major challenge or problem in international relations and in global politics. So, but in all this, where does larger questions of combating climate change, or for that matter, even addressing radical terrorism, and where do these appear to be solved in this?
Yeah, I think I was going to save that for my last few remarks on the way forward, suggesting that, that ultimately, I think the real challenge is going to be global leadership. And there is a crisis of global leadership, whichever way you look at it. And of course, I think one of the questions we often ask is, how can we, contribute to global public good, things like clean air and water, fresh water and things like that, but also the avoidance of global public bads like terrorism, for instance. And here again, quite clearly, we haven't fared as well as we should have fared, for instance, on the climate change question globally. Or if you think about, a whole range of other questions where norm building is essential. I think there will be pressures in some areas to create arrangements which are in the interests of most countries. But it would depend also ultimately on leadership. And given as liberal institutionalists would argue that somebody should be willing to foot at least a part of the bill, and the transaction costs of setting up these arrangements sometimes, involve in leadership initiatives of particular countries. And in the past, this has clearly rested with the United States in many ways. But as Professor Yahuda mentioned, I think there seems to be some reluctance, at least clearly in the Trump years, there was enormous reluctance and there was a pullback. And we'll have to see to what extent the US can continue to do this role, at least perhaps not in the manner in which it was doing earlier, but even if it can further, strengthen elements of multilateralism within the international order. I feel multilateralism is our best bet ultimately if we have to solve these global problems.
Yeah, that's true, sir. Thank you so much. So, Professor Dr. Satoru, I would like to ask this question as a matter of curiosity, as well as your thoughts on the AUKUS. Professor Yahuda mentioned about nuclearization and the nuclear power tussle. So, it did come as a surprise, right? The announcement of AUKUS right before the Quad summit was going to be held in the United States in-person summit. So it appears to have dwarfed the Quad structure. So is it, a Japanese perspective on whether you see it as, again, a reinforcement of the white Anglo or colonial power structure in terms of AUKUS, and also fostering or leading to a nuclear power tussle in the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you very much for asking me. In Japanese view, AUKUS is welcome, and Quad is also welcome, because we believe international security system, especially in the Indo-Pacific, has changed from hub and spoke to network-based. How different? Hub and spoke is based on the bilateral treaty-based alliance between US and Japan, US and Australia, US and Philippines, US and Thailand, US and. All of these are bilateral treaty-based alliance. So in this case, this hub and spoke system heavily depending on the US, because the US got all of the information, and all of the allies of the United States depend on the United States. So this is hub and spoke. But this system hasn't worked well to deter China's territorial expansion. That is the reason the network-based system has emerging. How different is, in this case, in the hub and spoke system, Japan and Australia both are US allies, but do not cooperate each other so deeply, because they are allies of the United States, but Japan and Australia is not formal treaty-based ally. So, but in the network-based system, each allies cooperate each other and share the burden of the United States. This is network-based. Sometimes we can find the trilateral cooperation of the Japan, Australia, India. This cooperation do not include the United States. Even if the US hasn't a part of it, US say this is welcome, because this is part of network-based system. What is AUKUS? What is Quad? Quad is important part of this system. Quad is a group, strategic cooperation, because this group includes all great powers in the Indo-Pacific except China. So this group is very powerful. But at the same time, AUKUS is also welcome. AUKUS is based on traditional alliance, but just now, as a network-based system, British and Australia cooperate each other. Because US, Australia, US, British, this is in the Indo-Pacific, this is traditional cooperation, but now trilateral cooperation. To build a network-based system, these are part of it. And at the same time, for a long time, this kind of trilateral-based cooperation as a part of the network-based security system hasn't achieved to fix something. They talk each other, they hold joint exercises, that's all. But this time, AUKUS achieved. They start joint arms development project, nuclear submarine. So in this case, this is one of the good example other trilateral cooperation can imitate. So other trilateral cooperation should start similar one, or at least they try to do. So as a part of the network-based system, both AUKUS and Quad are important. And other trilateral, other quadrilateral, or other bilateral cooperation is also important. This is a new type of the security system. So some people say, because of the AUKUS, we do not need Quad. That's not true. True thing is, both are part of the big security system. That's my answer. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Satoru. So I'll just move on to Professor Yahuda. Professor, there are, I'll take a few questions also from the audience, where one question is very important according to me, is by Dania Roshan, who asks how far women leadership can change the current political situation of the world, and tie it with my own question about populist leadership that you mentioned. Isn't it also true that such a nature of leadership, in whatever form that has existed and continues to exist, has much contributed to the image of that respective country as a major power? We are seeing that in India as well. So if you could respond to that, and also the question on women in leadership, sir.
Well, the extent to which the record of women leaders go, I think is very similar to men. I mean, if you think of your country, you had Indira Gandhi, and she introduced a form of martial law at one point. She looked at power in the same way as male leaders in India have, or perhaps she has been the most male of Indian leaders. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher can hardly be regarded as typical, or what women like to think of as typical of female behavior. And then in Sri Lanka, just next door to you, there are two ladies who are quite nasty to each other and to the supporters of the other. So although obviously there's a greater place for feminine roles in many countries, I'm not sure that it really makes that much of a difference in international relations. The foreign policies of countries are made up of all sorts of different elements. Gender may be an issue, but it's not a major issue. I think at the moment, when there's such big change from in highly developed countries, from manual labor to machinery, sets of machinery now. In the United States, you could argue that all those who used to do manual labor between the ages of, say, 20 and 40 are not interested in doing, if you like, caring jobs. I mean, there are some male nurses, there are some male teachers, but as an overall proportion, they're very small. And that means that there are a large number of semi-educated people between the ages of 20 and 40 who feel very resentful of what's happening and change. So not all is positive from the sense of modernity in the countries concerned. This is going to have effects in India as well. India hasn't reached that point, but nevertheless, the fact that machinery is replacing human labor is cheaper for the investors, and that's going to have its impact in one form or another in India as well. But I'd like to make another point. The issue of climate change was raised, I think, by Professor Siddharth. Is that the right pronunciation? And here we must note a real structural problem in international relations. Who represents global interests? Who speaks on behalf of global interests? All the institutions we have, international institutions, are ultimately based on states. Even those who speak for the United Nations are speaking for states. Now, there's no institution recognized as such by the world as a whole that says, look, we have a responsibility to the next generations, apart from ourselves, to deal with climate change. It's a global issue, yet we don't have the structures really to deal with it. We rely very much on the leaders of the very big countries who influence climate change. This includes China, the United States, India, and so on. Each one has its own interests. Each one has its own perspectives. Now, if they can agree, that's very nice. But we don't really have global institutions. And that's a real structural problem. We have, especially amongst the young, many who are pressing on climate change. The United States even has an ambassador designated to deal with climate change. But he's seen, wherever he goes, he's seen first as an American, not as a global character. And that's a dilemma in a way that we all face. And we can't just look for leaders of nations to deal with this. This requires a change in the outlooks. Now, people may think this is very, very unlikely. But if we were to think, as the professor mentioned earlier, about personal relationships, these are already, in many regards, global relationships. I mean, in the countries I know best are Israel, Britain, and the United States. And in all of them, you'll find peoples of various nationalities who are getting married, who are producing children, who want education of a particular kind, and so on. So at the lower level in society, there are people who, in their daily lives, want to have more interchange with others. But that's not the level that counts at the moment, because climate change is happening all around us. It's not just something for our children to worry about. And we don't really have the proper institutional mechanisms to deal with it.
Right. Thank you, sir. So we'll now move to the end of the session. Amazing session, I must say. The way forward round. And where do you see? This is a broad question which I would request each of you to respond to briefly in a minute or so, as to what are your views going ahead about the great powers and the international order, or even global interests, which Professor Yahuda has just raised. So I would start with Dr. Satoru. Over to you, sir. Briefly, in a minute.
Because of the Americans' failure to withdraw from Afghanistan and the Quad takeover just after the NATO troops withdraw from Afghanistan, the U.S. leadership is under threat. But this is just the image. In the long run, maybe U.S. will recover this image, I believe. So that is the reason the U.S. side countries Japan is a former ally, of course, but India is a great partner for the United States, and Australia is also a ally. So this Quad will be the very important and takes a role to decide international rule, I believe. So that is the reason we are under threat, but we will have the great future. And in this case, India's role is very important. So that is the reason we are looking forward to see the bright future of India. That is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you for that bright note of optimism. Thank you, sir. So Professor Siddharth, over to you.
Thank you. I think crystal ball gazing into the future in the best of times is fraught with huge problems. It's very hard to tell what it's going to look like in the future. But I think Professor Yahuda in his talk outlined, I think, some very important challenges for all the countries. And it'll ultimately depend on how they address those challenges. I think with India, for us, it's finding the right middle path. I think China, there are internal contradictions between political monopoly and economic competition. Some comparative politics theorists believe that that's likely to unravel at some point. We don't know if that's true, but we'll have to wait and watch. With the United States, quite clearly, it's about reining in, elements which turn their back on multilateralism and more positive forms of internationalism, and that's not necessarily a good thing for the world too at some level. And so I think it will depend ultimately on also the quality of global leadership, which is going to determine ultimately the manner in which we approach these questions. And I do believe that we will have to navigate an imperfect world, and we'll have to make the best of an imperfect world. But if politics is the art of the possible, we have to find solutions to the problems we face globally and not just nationally.
True, absolutely, sir. Thank you. Professor Yahuda, over to you. Your concluding thoughts.
Well, looking ahead is very difficult because if we don't really know the immediate past, then we may face problems that, looking back on them, we can say, oh yes, this was obvious and so on. But at the time it isn't. And we are at one of these times in which a whole number of contradictions, which are mutually related, are pressing down on us. And if I said we don't have proper global institutions, well, we haven't really got international institutions dealing with a problem that is emerging everywhere, and that is the older generation. It affects every country, not always in the same way, but nevertheless, there's that. So I would suggest that one of the problems we have in looking at the future is a number of very, very large issues that transcend the particular selfish interests of particular countries. Then, as far as countries are concerned, I think that opportunities exist for those who favor international society to operate. I say those who favor it rather than just democracies, because I think that there's no democratic system that we can say, oh, that's working extremely well. We should all be like that. I don't think we can find such a system in the world today. This doesn't mean to say that democracy is not a very powerful, well, I was going to say ideology. It's more than ideology. But democracy is clearly a very, very central idea in discussions of politics, even in countries which are not democratic. In China, for example, which would seem to be the prime example of authoritarian leadership and organization and so on. There are many, many different interests. If you speak to intellectuals in China, you'll find that their ideas are differ from each other, never mind differing from people like me. And so there is a case for optimism, but it requires, if we like, it requires us to move away from populism. I think populism is attractive in many countries, and it's a real danger to the countries themselves. And the outside world can't really intervene in the domestic affairs successfully. So, it's a question of how you balance the depth of the problems we face with the opportunities we also have. When I was a boy, the world was very, very different. It was just recovering from the Second World War, and England was a very drab place, and most of Europe was too. Yet people think of Europe as the sort of the heart of democracy. It wasn't so. Perhaps one of the major contributions that the United States has made that is not generally acknowledged, that it didn't seek to get revenge from those that their soldiers fought against. On the contrary, amongst the richest countries now are Japan and Germany. And that was only possible because of the United States. I can't think of another empire, if you like, that treated its adversaries who'd gone to war, treated it in the same way. And Russia, which has suffered much more than perhaps than any other country, just wanted reparations. Wanted them from Germany, wanted them from here and there. The United States was not a knight in shining armor by any means, but nevertheless, what it did for Germany and for Japan has made a real difference, not just to them, but to all of us. And if that can happen, then who knows what else can happen? So there are grounds for optimism, although we tend to deal all the time with problems. I open a newspaper. Where do you find nice, happy developments? You don't. They always focus on the problems. And whereas in our normal life, daily life, we know there are problems, but we also know that there are grounds for hope. And I think that's true internationally.
Thank you, sir. What a beautiful way to end this wonderful discussion. Yes, so I would now conclude by formally proposing the vote of thanks. Actually, thank you so much, Professor Yahuda, for sparing your time and for this wonderful distinguished lecture on different powers among the great, different views among the great powers about the international order. For the State of International Affairs #Diplomacy Dialogue series under the auspices of the IMPRI Center for International Relations and Strategic Studies. And I would also like to thank Professor Siddharth Mallavarapu and also Dr. Satoru Nagao. Actually, you have been so patiently, you have responded, you have taken the questions and also responded to them. you have actually added to the practice, the literature, and also the theory of international relations for the times to come. I mean, it has been so personally enriching. I'm sure all those who have watched and those who would be watching us later would concur to that. And thank you all for making a very rich contribution to the study of international relations. We are really deeply humbled and honored to have had this discussion. Thank you so much, Professor Yahuda, Professor Mallavarapu, and Dr. Nagao. Thank you so much. And thank you to all those who are watching us here on Facebook Live and on Zoom, and also those who would be listening to our podcasts and watching us on YouTube later. Thank you, and I wish you all a very good day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
It's been an honor. Thank you.
It's been our honor, sir. Thank you.